IVM.
Hi, I'm Rohan Joshi, and on my podcast, the show about crypto, I've been having some pretty cool conversations with industry experts about what exactly cryptocurrency is and what makes it so exciting. If you haven't already, please check it out on the IVM Podcasts Network. Now, a quick shout out to my fellow crypto heads. We've got a listener survey going on, which will take not more than 10 minutes of your time to fill out. So please check the link in the description and help me out by filling it up. Don't forget to tune into a show about crypto on the IVM app and wherever you get your podcasts from.
There is a potential that NDMA, which is nitrosodimethylamine, can be formed in the metformin. Metformin is an anti-diabetic drug. Then the company has to ensure it doesn't go above a certain level, which is associated with cancer. Okay. Now, all these Indian companies that supply metformin to the US are very tightly adherent to the standard, and every few days there is news of recalls in the US. For example, very recently there was news of an Indian company, I don't remember the name, recalling a huge batch of metformin in the US because it was found to have NDMA. Nothing is happening in India on this front. So none of these companies are required to keep up imposed limits on nitrosamines.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast. One of the places that we are supposed to feel the safest is when we are with people of medicine, our trusted family doctor or our neighborhood pharmacist, or when we are under the care of the medication that was prescribed to us. What if I told you that if you're in India, most of the medication that you're taking is a risk? For a country that aspires to be the pharmacy to the world, our drug regulation processes are in shocking disarray. The regulatory bodies are riddled with manpower, equipment, and supply chain challenges that have reduced drug regulation to rigorless rubber stamps. Add to it the restlessness of an economy that is trying to be a market leader, and you have a dangerous concoction, one that has cost many lives in this country. Predictably, of course, those of the economically poor. My guest, Priyanka Pulla, is an independent journalist who's been writing on health, medicine, and public policy issues. She's been published in The Wire, Mint, the British Medical Journal, and several other publications. Over the last couple of years, Priyanka has been working on a series of stories on the quality of medicines sold in India and the Indian drug regulatory system itself. She spoke to me about how drug regulation and drug testing especially has major gaps and is in many cases close to even being non-existent, and how this is true even for some of the most common medicines that we take for fever, cough, or blood pressure. The scariest thing that she spoke about, though, is how we might not even know the true impact of this, as there is no way for us to correlate something that has gone wrong with the drug that we took. Stay with us. We'll be right back on the Filter Koffee Podcast.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Storytellers and Storytellers, Vineet talks to acclaimed filmmaker Nikhil Advani about his latest web series, Rocket Boys. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam talks to Nitin Gupta, founder and CEO at Uni, about their new Pay 1/3 card. On Raw and Organics, Sweta Subaya, founder of Sweat, bursts some pretty pervasive myths around fitness for women with Kunal. The Simplified hosts deconstruct all there is to artificial intelligence with AI practitioners Karthik and Shivam. And on All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk discuss evolving notions of warfare with the advent of digital technologies. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our others for that matter, please do tell a friend. Don't forget to rate us on any other platforms that you're listening to us, whether it's a rating, whether it's a review, it all helps. And do remember to check us out on YouTube. We have a number of channels. They're available on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, I would like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda, CoinSwitch, Kuber, and HDFC Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast, Priyanka. How are you doing and where are you talking to us from?
I'm doing good. I'm based in Bangalore. So yeah, look forward to doing this.
Yeah, we are speaking on the 17th of Jan, 2022. How are things in Bangalore? Is it at boiling point or more from a COVID perspective, that is?
Where I stay in my apartment complex, we're seeing like, it's a massive apartment complex. So we're seeing like 5 or 6 new cases every day. So that's probably the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, I would hope this is the boiling point and it doesn't get worse than this. So yeah.
Great. Priyanka, for a while now, you've been writing about, the quality of medicines sold in India and the Indian drug regulatory system itself. There is so much for us to speak about, about the different stories you've broken, especially in the last couple of years or so. But I wanted to start the conversation with the Remdesivir story. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, sure. So I'm basically a health journalist, and I've been writing quite extensively about COVID naturally in the last couple of years. But also in the last couple of years, another thing I've been doing is I've been working on a specific project on drug quality. I have a public health journalism grant from Thakur Foundation. So the goal of this project was to actually look at drug quality issues, which is why I've been doing it in a sort of focused manner. So in that context, it was already something, which was on my radar, any drug quality issue. And I came across this story of Remdesivir. Actually, somebody, I cannot disclose my source in this case, but somebody alerted me to this problem which had occurred in several North Indian states and in Maharashtra, that several batches of Remdesivir from one company were associated with severe adverse events. So I learned about this and I thought it would be a fantastic opportunity to actually, I knew theoretically what the issues with drug testing were in India by then, right? We have weak quality standards, we have poorly equipped state regulatory bodies, etc. But I knew right then that this Remdesivir example would be a fantastic way to actually see those theoretical weaknesses play out and how they actually affect, how they can actually create specific quality problem, right? So I was really interested in this from the very beginning. And so my idea was to look at how these adverse events came about. Did the state regulatory bodies do a good job of investigating them? Because I knew what the process was on paper, but I wanted to map out what it was in practice. And so did the regulatory authorities respond well? Did they identify what the issue was? Because anytime a drug is associated with an adverse event, on paper, we have a pharmacovigilance system in place whose only job is to identify why that happened. Is it an intrinsic property of the drug? Is it because the drug was substandard, or was it something else? Because that is, it's a key part of quality assurance in our regulatory regime. So yeah, that was my goal. I learned about it from somebody, let's say a good Samaritan. And then I decided to look at this entire incident end to end. So,
yeah. Before you get into what actually happened, could you walk us through a little bit about what the process was supposed to be, at least on paper?
Sure. Okay. So basically, drug quality is the responsibility of our state drug regulators. So every state has a regulatory authorities, the Food and Drug, FDA in Maharashtra, they all have different names for some strange reason. So, in Maharashtra, it's FDA, it's FDCA in Uttar Pradesh, but it's many of us don't realize it. We think the Central Drug Regulatory Authority, CDSCO, does it for the entire country, but that's not true. It's actually a very local thing. Okay. Now, these state regulatory authorities, what they do is they give licenses to the manufacturers, and they also ensure that the drugs sold in the sales and distribution outlets are of good quality. So for the manufacturers in the state, it is up to them to ensure that, it's up to the regulatory authority to ensure that they're following these so-called good manufacturing practices, which is central to drug quality, right? Now, good manufacturing practices is like a whole different field, but it's just simple things like when you get the raw material, you have to test it. You have to maintain a record of, the results. And then when the batch is manufactured, then, you test it again, specifically on quality parameters and, hygiene in the plant, especially for, injectable drugs for which, hygiene is a sort of a very weak word to describe the level of controls required for an injectable plant. But so those are good manufacturing processes. Like you ensure that your manufacturing process is very tightly controlled, and the state drug regulator has to make sure that these manufacturers do so by conducting regular inspections. Okay, so that is one pillar of drug quality, which is the inspections of manufacturing facilities to make sure they're following the process. And then once the drug is manufactured and comes to the market, the second pillar is random testing, where these regulators go to stores and they just pick up a random sample of drugs and they send them to their labs and they're tested on specific quality parameters, which are actually very well defined. So, and then a third pillar is pharmacovigilance, which is that when you hear about adverse events from hospitals or something, let's say a particular batch is associated with adverse events, because it could be associated with the quality of the product, you immediately launch an investigation. It's actually the manufacturer's job to do the investigation. It's not the regulators. The manufacturer has to do the entire investigation, do a so-called root cause analysis, let the regulator know, and the regulator has to satisfy themselves. So these are basically the three pillars: GMP inspections, random testing, and pharmacovigilance. And that's what I was looking at in the Remdesivir story.
So an organization like correct me if I'm saying this wrong, the Center of Pharmacopoeia, what is the role of that organization?
Right. So there is an organization called the Indian Pharmacopoeia Commission, and this body essentially sets the quality standards which have to be followed by all drugs in the country in a text called the Indian Pharmacopoeia, right? So I'm thinking of an equivalent in...
The FDA in the US probably?
No, so the equivalent in the US would be the US Pharmacopoeia Commission. The equivalent of the FDA in India is the CDSCO. So anyway, for instance, you have N95 masks. They have to follow a set of standards, and these standards in India are set by the BIS, the Bureau of Indian Standards. Not N95, but FFP2 masks is what they called in India, right? So the filtration rate and the seal and the things like that are decided by the BIS. So similarly, the Indian Pharmacopoeia sets standards for drugs. And these standards are, I'll just quickly run through what these standards look like. So let's say you take an oral tablet, like say paracetamol. So typically the standard will include content. So if you have 650 milligrams paracetamol tablet, the amount of paracetamol in the tablet cannot vary beyond 95% to 105% of the 650 milligrams. That's just an example of one standard. The second standard is identity. The paracetamol tablet has to have paracetamol in it. So if it claims to be paracetamol on the blister pack, that's what you will find inside when you test it. Right. And another very important standard for tablets is dissolution. So once it enters your body, it has to go into solution at a specific rate, because otherwise it's not going to enter your bloodstream and it may pass through your body, unmetabolized, right? In which case it will not have any effect. So for many oral dosage forms, including tablets, capsules, even suppositories and pessaries, dissolution is a very important quality standard. Again, very tightly controlled. Like within half an hour, it has to release 85% of its, the active ingredient, and the methods are defined like very, very specifically. And another important quality specification is impurities. So apart from the paracetamol and the excipient in the drug, and the excipient is what gives bulk to the drug, and it may improve dissolution, it may improve taste, things like that. Apart from the active ingredient, which is paracetamol and excipient, there should not be anything else. And if there is anything else, it has to be, again, in very, very, very well-defined limits. So there's an entire science that goes into how you define these limits for impurities. So typically for an oral drug form, oral dosage form, these are some of the important standards in the Indian Pharmacopoeia.
Right.
There are many more. Yeah.
So basically, just to paraphrase, for a layman like me to sort of understand this, the active ingredient is really the molecule or whatever, which is supposed to do the work for you.
Yeah.
And the excipient is basically how do you put it in context for your body, right? Like how it is supposed to be injected, how it is supposed to be taken, how basically paving the way for the active ingredient to sort of work. Often the excipient can be extraordinarily harmful for your body if it is not done according to the standards. Something like that?
Yeah, I mean, if it is extraordinarily harmful, then it will not even be allowed for use in drug manufacturing. So even excipients are very tightly controlled. So yeah, I mean, that would be a good way of looking at it. Excipient basically gives it form and bulk and flavor and stability, so many different things. Yeah.
Right. So this is how it is supposed to happen. But of course, as you went through this rabbit hole of the Remdesivir thing, you found that there were big lapses, right? You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So what happened is during the peak of the second wave, this happened in May 2021, there were dozens of hospitals in several North Indian states, including Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and even Maharashtra, where many of these hospitals, including both government and private hospitals, started noticing that a particular batches of remdesivir from Zydus Cadila were associated with adverse events. Now, the thing to remember is that remdesivir itself can cause serious adverse events, right? It's not like any drug. All drugs have a small possibility of causing adverse events. And also, just the fact that it's an infusion, it can be related to infusion reactions, etc. But the doctors noticed that this was strongly associated with particular batches, and it was unusual enough for them to report to various pharmacovigilance bodies, including the Indian Pharmacopoeia Commission, including the manufacturer. So one of the things hospitals can do is just inform the manufacturer directly, and the Zydus Cadila is then obliged to inform their state regulator. So that's how the system works. So in all these hospitals, the doctors were noticing that within 15 minutes of taking the drug, within 15 minutes to an hour, patients would deteriorate in unexpected ways, right? They would start experiencing fever and chills, so-called rigors, in which your temperature suddenly spikes up and then you start experiencing this uncontrollable shaking. And they would also experience sudden drops in SpO2. So if a patient was stable on, say, 5 liters of oxygen for a while, they would suddenly deteriorate. So it was stark enough for them to report, which itself was saying something, because if you can imagine, that was a really chaotic time for hospitals across India. Hospitals were like overloaded. Doctors were under a lot of work pressure, and normally it's not really normal for doctors to think about adverse events and actually report it. Pharmacovigilance in general is very poor in India. Doctors don't usually do this. So the very fact that they did it was significant enough to me. Okay. And at that point of time, the intuitive first step for the state drug regulators in each of these states, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, etc., was to collect the affected sample and to run it through the standard quality tests. And for injectables in general, the standard quality tests are slightly different from what they are for tablets. So you have identity and assay, but really important is so-called sterility and endotoxins. Okay. Now, sterility is basically you don't want injectables to have any microbial contamination. I mean, it's very easy for, I'm sure, listeners to understand why, because you're just putting it directly into your bloodstream. And if it has a tiny amount of viable microorganisms and it multiplies in your bloodstream, you're basically screwed. Also remember that these are being given to people who are already sick, whose immune system is already dysregulated. And then bacterial endotoxins are basically the outer layer of gram-negative bacteria. So these bacteria basically shed it into the bloodstream. Again, they are associated with septic shock and fever and chills. So these two parameters are very tightly controlled for injectables. So what should these regulators have done? They should have tested on these grounds. So to my utter shock, I realized that some of the top regulators, for instance, the Maharashtra state regulator, I call them top regulator because there's a major multiple manufacturing units in Maharashtra, and it's a fairly well-resourced regulator. They have good labs. They have all the facilities required. They did not do this bacterial endotoxin test on the affected batch. Not only did they not do it, they also declared the drug to be of standard quality without doing it, which is a bit insane, because if you talk to anybody from the industry, they will tell you how core an endotoxin test is to drugs. Like all of us may not really realize it as lay listeners, but it's a bit absurd. Okay. So that happened in Maharashtra. It happened in UP also. UP skipped not just bacterial endotoxin, but also sterility testing. Now, sterility testing is slightly, I guess, is more commonly done. And now sterility and bacterial endotoxin are two different things. It's another thing we need to remember, which strangely enough, a lot of people don't appreciate, because sterility is a lack of live microorganisms and bacterial endotoxins is the lack of these basically proteins. Just because you do a sterility test and the drug passes it, that doesn't mean it will pass the endotoxin test. And the interesting thing I found while interviewing these regulators was that they had confused notions about the interchangeability of sterility and bacterial endotoxins. For instance, the lab in Maharashtra They thought it was okay to do a sterility test and to skip the bacterial endotoxin test. That's really a bit crazy. But anyway, so in UP, they skipped both the sterility and endotoxin tests. In Rajasthan, they did not test at all for various other reasons. In Gujarat, I could not find any evidence that the labs tested. And and the only state which tested was Bihar, basically. And the reason this happened is that Bihar does not have any local labs that can do injectable testing, that can do sterility and endotoxin testing. So the regulator sent the sample out of the state to a so-called central drug lab called CDL Kolkata, which did have the facilities. They did the test and they found endotoxins in Zydus Cadula's product. So amazingly, that was the only state that identified what could potentially have been the cause of these adverse effects. So bacterial endotoxins can cause fever and chills in patients.
Right. Two big questions that come to my mind as we were talking about this. One is, before we go into the Bihar example, the tests you're talking about, right? Just again, to put it in a layman's perspective, it's almost like a crash test. Would you say it is analogous to a crash test when you're manufacturing an automobile, like as critical as that from a safety perspective?
So I'm not entirely sure what a crash test is.
Something that makes sure that your airbags are working, right? Largely, yeah.
I mean, if you're saying it's central, yes, I would say it's central to injectables because it's very easy for injectables. See, India already has a lot of GMP issues. It's known that there are all these small and medium scale manufacturing industries which are not complying very well to good manufacturing practices. And the drug can easily become unsterile if the quality of your water is poor, right? If you're not taking adequate care. And once endotoxins get into the drug, it's very difficult to take it out. So the only way I believe you can ensure lack of endotoxins is to control your process very tightly from the very beginning. Like there is no place from which raw material or water or whatever. So it's a test that can very easily be it's a quality parameter that can easily be violated and therefore it's really critical. So I guess if a crash test is a core part of it would be analogous. Yeah.
Did Bihar react differently to the drug now that they have done the testing?
They did. So they filed a case against Zydus Cadula in a local court, which is what typically drug regulators do. Under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, they can file a case against the company if it makes a substandard drug. And the penalty is basically, for something like this, it can be up to more than a year in jail and a fine. But unfortunately, these cases can go on forever and ever and ever. So, yeah.
Right. You speak about these populist states like, UP and others. And I wanted to ask you, how well are they prepared, not just in the Remdesivir case, generally from a drug testing perspective, right? How well are they prepared? Do they have the funds? Do they have the people and the know-how to even do this?
Doesn't look like it, because for Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, if you do not have an injectable testing facility, and they don't, that is insane, because injectables are a large part of the drugs we use, right? And think about the number of... so in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, as far as I know, do not have major manufacturing facilities, but the drug regulator's job is to mainly monitor the sales and distribution outlets, which there are like thousands and thousands of because they're such populous states. So how do you know if the injectables have issues like this if you're not able to test it locally? Yes, you can send it to CDL Kolkata, but CDL Kolkata is catering to so many other things. It's catering to multiple other states. It's just one small part of what they do is just sort of chip in with what Uttar Pradesh is doing. So they can't rely on CDL Kolkata. They have to have their own local lab. And that really makes me worry about the quality of injections they're getting, right? It also makes me think about the fact that Uttar Pradesh is one of the states from which almost every year you hear about this mystery fever and this mystery outbreak, and which remains undiagnosed for years and years. And I wonder how much of this has to do with drug quality. And so just the fact that they don't have injectable testing facilities, to me, is a proxy of how poorly resourced they are. Even apart from that, their lack of, frankly speaking, there is no state which has as many drug inspectors as it should have. Some are far worse than the others, but There's a so-called Marshall formula that is supposed to help you decide how many drug inspectors a particular state has, depending on the number of manufacturing units and the sales and distribution outlets it has. And I don't think there's any state in India that meets the Marshall formula, either in terms of sanctioned number of inspectors or the number of posts filled. Like Maharashtra, Gujarat, all of them are running short. I haven't specifically looked into UP and Bihar, but they're probably terrible. And it's not just UP and Bihar. In a different story, I looked at what the lab in Himachal Pradesh was doing. Again, remember that Himachal Pradesh is a major manufacturing hub in India, and according to some estimates, it provides 80% of the APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, to like South Asia. Like it's a major manufacturing hub for the world, you can say. And their lab is so poorly equipped, because from what I learned is that I described earlier what the different quality parameters for oral drug dosage forms are: their ID, assay, dissolution, and impurities. And I came to know that they don't do any impurity testing at all because they don't have the facilities. And I wouldn't be surprised if they don't do sterility testing either. So it's in really bad shape for sure.
That's actually quite chilling, right? What you just said, which is like, all of the states in India, none of the states in India are actually prepared to do the kind of drug testing that we need to do. Before I go into how we got here, the other part you mentioned is also random testing, right?
Yeah.
Which requires you to visit the manufacturer's premises or visit different places where the drugs are being sold, etc., and then test. What is the state of that in India right now?
It's not great. So the state regulators set a sort of benchmark for themselves in terms of how many samples they should collect from each district every month for random testing, right? For sales and distribution outlets. And so again, there's a lot of state to state variation, as you can imagine. The sampling isn't great. It tends to be sort of skewed towards some commonly used drugs like paracetamol, etc. But some of these more difficult to test drugs like biologicals and injectables, I don't think the sampling is great for those, right? So they may be sort of flying on, even in states like Karnataka, which are, again, supposedly better resourced, better equipped labs, etc. So no, the sampling isn't great. And there are, I don't have the numbers at hand, but in 2017, there was a parliamentary Lok Sabha answer in which the Ministry of Health had talked about the rate of substandard drugs in India. And they looked at the number of samples tested in 1 year, which was around, if I remember right, it was around 87,000 or so for the entire country. This is random sampling, and that's just not representative, right? So yeah, that's random sampling. But the other is inspections of manufacturing facilities, which is arguably more important. And I will tell you why. So increasingly in the drug manufacturing industries is a recognition of the fact that just testing is not enough to ensure drug quality, because these quality standards are very limited, okay? Quality standards are focused at the biggest risk in a particular drug. So for paracetamol, the biggest risk is paracetamol is less, and there is this particular impurity which is toxic. So please test for this impurity. But there are multiple other impurities that can get into paracetamol, which you're not really testing for in this random testing. Okay. So the only way you can control for these impurities is by controlling the manufacturing process. And we have realized many times in history that a drug that passes drug testing doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. This happened in the heparin disaster in USA. I don't remember the year. It applies to the recent nitrosamine fiasco, I would say, where many different countries realized in 2017 that some of the commonly used drugs had this carcinogen called nitrosamines, which they were simply not testing until 2017, because testing for nitrosamines requires very high-end devices called basically liquid chromatography, tandem mass spectroscopy. They're toxic. Nitrosamines are toxic in very small quantities. So our testing regime until then was simply not designed to detect nitrosamines. And yet they were introduced because of changes in manufacturing processes, which were not well controlled. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that testing is not enough. The manufacturing facility has to follow good manufacturing practices, for which the state drug regulator has to inspect them regularly and do random checks, which they don't do because they don't have enough drug inspectors. They're supposed to, visit them once a year and spend a couple of days, but I really, really don't think they do that. So, yeah.
You mentioned the Lok Sabha speech in 2017. I'm assuming this is the one where it was also mentioned that only less than 3% of the drugs manufactured in India or for the Indian market fail to meet the necessary norms. But your point is that with 87,000 tests, that entire research is extraordinarily based on a very, very low, insignificant sample.
Yeah, the sample is low. And also in a different story, which I wrote, one of the other problems I pointed out is none of the states are testing drugs for impurities. So, which is one of, again, the 4 quality parameters for many drugs. So impurity testing is a bit of a sophisticated process. You need a lot of different inputs. You need a small, highly pure sample of that particular impurity. So for instance, let's say you want to test for nitrosamines, then you need a small sample of NDMA, which is one of the common nitrosamines. You need a placebo version of the drug. And so many of these state drug regulatory labs, where do you purchase the small sample of nitrosamines from? You need to pay money to either the Indian Pharmacopoeia Commission, or you need to go to the private sector to buy these impurity standards. So for various reasons, this particular test is not being done anywhere across India. So when our politicians come and tell us that only 3% of our drugs are substandard, basically what is happening is something along the lines of what happened in Remdesivir case, where Maharashtra did not do all the quality testing for Remdesivir, left out endotoxin and said the drug is standard. So if that is the level of quality testing, then the 3% is not believable at all. So
where is the root of this problem? I was just thinking as you were speaking, drug testing and regulation seems like a dangerous candidate to be run like a bootstrapped startup, isn't it? Doing whatever we possibly can, etc. I mean, it could cost lives and it should be run as a watertight, zero-error mission, isn't it? And today, it almost seems like we've left it to the individual interpretations of those in different states. How did we get here, and what is the root of this problem?
Yeah, so in my opinion, all of this goes back to some conscious decisions Indian policymakers have taken historically to expand access to drugs in India and to encourage the local manufacturing industry, right? And the conscious decision was to not aggressively keep up with global quality standards, because it's very expensive and it's a very resource-intensive activity to keep up with these daily changing global standards, which would have wiped out our, the small and medium-scale pharmaceutical industry, which is sort of just finding its feet. So the decision was to sort of go slow until our pharmaceutical industry has a chance to thrive and get to a point where, we can actually start looking at quality too. So to me, a lot goes back to that decision, which was made at various points, purely for the purpose of expanding access. So I've spoken to various people about this issue at various times. And I remember I spoke to some fairly senior person associated with the Indian Pharmacopoeia Commission. And I remember him telling me, so the US Pharmacopoeia and the British Pharmacopoeia and EP are known to be the most stringent quality standards in the world, right? They control their impurities very, very tightly. They have very tight, they have very up-to-date tests for, dissolution or identity, etc., etc. The Indian Pharmacopoeia, not so much. And one of the things he told me is that there are countries which decided to just adopt the US Pharmacopoeia at a very early stage, just to keep up with global quality standards, but it wiped out the local industry. Right. So this is what our Indian policymakers were trying to avoid. They were trying to give our industry some space to grow. And grow the industry did, right? So now India is one of the largest generics manufacturer in the world. But what has happened as a result is that we have different layers of quality in the industry. So manufacturers who provide to the US or Europe have to meet these extraordinarily high quality standards of the USP and BP. Whereas if they have to provide the same drug to India, they can just throw some of those quality standards out of the window. Not all the quality standards, but we do follow more lenient quality standards. So that's the unfortunate situation which has been created. Now, a lot of people in the industry are today of the view that because we are in a good place, even the small and medium industry is in a place to make investments in quality, we should now start aligning ourselves with some of these global stringent standards. We should start harmonizing. That's the word for it. So there is an international body called the International Conference for Harmonization. It's called the ICH, which writes guidelines for stuff like impurities and dissolution and blah, 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 GMP. Again, that's sort of like a guiding light for quality standards across the world, right? So a lot of people are of the view that we need to now start falling in line with the ICH standards, because we can't make the excuse anymore that we are this burgeoning, growing industry and following these globally accepted quality standards would kill our industry. So yeah, I think that is the root of the problem, the decision we made to just help our industry grow for a while. Yeah.
You spoke about how there are double standards on one drugs made, even if it is from India, made for the international market, and then of course drugs which are made for the Indian market. And here I'm reminded of something I was listening to from Dinesh Thakur, and of course for the uninitiated, Dinesh Thakur, was part of Ranbaxy, and then he became one of the very celebrated whistleblowers, and of course he's also at the core of the foundation that you mentioned at the beginning. And the thing that he had mentioned was again the Ranbaxy case, where what he found out from the data internally was that there was about 40-50% of data that was falsified when it came to the US market. But as far as the Indian market is concerned, almost all of their data, 100% of the data was falsified, right? Which was, to me, extraordinarily chilling when I heard that, right?
Yeah.
Is that generally the norm when it comes to across drug companies?
It's probably not the norm. I mean, I think it would be an oversimplification to say that every company is indulging in fraud. But we also have to remember that if the legally mandated quality standards by the Indian regulator are lower, then, even the most honest company is just not going to do it. It's not going to go above and beyond to sort of keep up with, a more stringent. It's an issue of cost. It's an issue of survival. So even without worrying about fraud, forget about fraud. Let's assume all companies are honest. Even then, we have different quality standards. So for instance, nitrosamines. Nitrosamines is actually probably not the best example, because it was an impurity that was discovered only in 2017. But there are far worse examples of quality issues which were discovered like almost in 2006, and India still hasn't caught up with them. But let me talk about nitrosamines because it's such a current issue. So in 2017, basically the whole world discovered that drugs can have nitrosamines. Within the next 2 or 3 years, the US, Europe, everybody put in these really stringent guidelines for nitrosamines. So let's say you're making metformin, and there is a potential that NDMA, which is nitrosodimethylamine, can be formed in the metformin. Metformin is an anti-diabetic drug. Then the company has to ensure it doesn't go above a certain level, which is associated with cancer. Okay. Now, all these Indian companies that supply metformin to the US are very tightly adherent to the standard. And every few days, there is news of recalls in the US. For example, very recently, there was news of an Indian company, I don't remember the name, recalling a huge batch of metformin in the US because it was found to have NDMA. Nothing is happening in India on this front. So none of these companies are required to keep up imposed limits on nitrosamines. Now, which were the products affected by nitrosamines? Ranitidine, the entire class of sartans, which are blood pressure drugs, so valsartan, losartan, blah, 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 metformin. And so after this nitrosamine saga came to light, companies like Cadila and Torrent and Dr. Reddy's and Aurobindo, they did massive recalls in the US. There were no recalls in India. And even though I'm guessing the process and the product is really similar, right? So the risk of nitrosamines developing is similar in both cases. So these are not companies indulging in fraud. It's just that they're not required to do something by our regulator. So, yeah, that is why.
This act that draws the framework on this is what, like 1940 Act, which is Drug and Cosmetic Act of India, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the Drugs and Cosmetics Act 1940. I mean, there have been amendments and there have been rules made later, but in general, it's really outdated. It's hasn't kept up with the science of today. And so there have been various attempts over time to overhaul it, but unfortunately, in my mind, many of these attempts have been sort of wrong-headed. There's one sort of full-fledged attempt happening right now There's a high power committee that has been put into place to rewrite the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. But there are multiple problems with it. One is that they're working in complete opacity. Like nobody knows what they're doing, right? It's such a critical act, but the only news we are getting about the suggestions they have come up with is in the form of these newspaper articles from anonymous sources. And these newspaper articles from anonymous sources tell us that their focus seems to be making life easier for the industry, right? So they are trying more and more to be less bureaucratic in terms of giving licenses and just making life easier for them. But none of the focus seems to be on drug quality, which is a huge issue, right? There is hardly any talk about that, at least as far as public record of their discussions is going. So yeah, I worry that this system is going to be perpetuated forever unless the public becomes aware of how core the Drugs and Cosmetics Act is to their personal health and the medicines they're taking every single day. Yeah.
It sounds like the revamp will actually make the problems worse than it would better, right?
Yeah.
If licensing is going to become easier, then I'm assuming the whole thing is about looking at it as the ease of business, quote unquote, more than anything
which
else.
is what it has been all these years, which is what the original problem is. That so in fact, there's a pharmaceutical journalist called Gauri Kamath who a while ago, ages ago, I think 2012, she wrote a blog post about CDSCO, which had come up with a mission statement for themselves at that point of time. And I'm just paraphrasing what the CDSCO wanted to do. The CDSCO's mission statement was to help the pharmaceutical industry meet its goals and ambitions. Right? And whereas any drug regulator, really their core goal is to protect the patients. Right. And sure, I mean, of course, you have to make lives easier for pharmaceutical industries because that is the only way you can protect your patients, because you can improve the supply of drugs. But really, what is the drug regulator's core goal is, cannot in isolation be to help the pharmaceutical industry grow. But so I personally don't have a problem with being less bureaucratic. That's important. Right? Yeah, because, more bureaucracy also leads to more corruption, and more corruption also impacts quality standards. For instance, if a drug inspector can just randomly impose penalties on a manufacturing company and say, unless you give me a bribe, because the rules are not properly spelled out, he says, I'm going to file some charges against you unless you give me a bribe. So that is a real problem. Excessive bureaucracy is a real problem, but that's not the only problem. The bigger problem, I would think, is quality issues. And unfortunately, there's not enough focus on it right now. Hardly any focus.
The sort of the mission statement you just mentioned, that's the kind of stuff I'll put as a mission statement for, say, a lobbying body for an industry. Right?
Yeah.
Not for a regulator. And the thing is, to me, I think the perils of this is bigger than we imagine, and it is much closer to you than one imagines, right? I mean, what you just said about nitrosamines, something that had shook the world almost a decade and a half back, is yet to find its impact in India, isn't it? And I'm also thinking, like, it's not, just to put this in perspective, we are not talking about, say, for example, is India good enough to be on the quality standards along with other countries? It's not only that, right? It is actual safety, it is actual loss of lives. The impact is much more real, and the human impact is much more than we imagine, isn't it? And at this point, maybe we should put the focus on the Ramnagar incident, right, where regulators were clearly not inspecting the manufacturing unit properly, and which led to an incident where children died in Ramnagar which is in Jammu, after consuming cough syrup in 2020, isn't it? Can you talk to us a little bit about the incident and also what that reveals?
Yeah. So this happened in 2020 when the particular brand of cough syrup called Coldbest, manufactured by a Himachal Pradesh-based company. So Himachal Pradesh has this pharmaceutical SEZ in Baddi, which I spoke about earlier. Like, it's a major drug manufacturer in the country. So there is a pharmaceutical company based there called Digital Vision, which has like hundreds and hundreds of products. And the Coldbest manufactured by the company was consumed by children in Jammu. And all of them immediately started falling grievously ill, right? They had to be rushed to, they stopped urinating and started getting fever and things like that. And they had to be rushed to a hospital, but they were so sick that many of them had to be transferred to one of the biggest tertiary care hospitals in North India, which is Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research in Chandigarh. So these children were moved there, and they were all diagnosed with acute kidney injury because of toxicity. So there was some toxic product. And amazingly, this is again something that doesn't happen often enough. Amazingly, the doctors at Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research went above and beyond. Instead of just treating the children, they actually investigated what was causing this issue. They went back to Ramnagar, Jammu. They collected soil samples, they collected water samples, food samples from around the area, because they wanted to know what is happening here. This was a so-called geographic cluster where a bunch of people are falling ill in a small region. So there must be a common cause. So they tested for viruses and bacteria and heavy metals. And they also tested the various medicines these children had been given when they fell sick. And they managed to find in one of the cough syrup, which had been consumed by all the children, a really, really toxic chemical called diethylene glycol. So firstly, I want to emphasize how amazing the fact that the doctors found it is. I think it's underappreciated because, again, as I was saying earlier, there's so many of these mystery illnesses and clusters in India, like the encephalitis cluster in Uttar Pradesh, where every year children fall sick and nobody knows what is causing the encephalitis. So the doctors in PGI-MER could have let it go, and they could have just treated the children and say, oh, we don't know what happened. But they did, and they also had the equipment to do it. They had this gas chromatography instrument in their lab, which allowed them to test for diethylene glycol. They went through literature to see what could cause some of these symptoms, such as toxic nephropathy, and they found incidence of diethylene glycol historically, and they tested and they found. So now the fact that diethylene glycol got into the drug is quite insane, because diethylene glycol is a very well-known adulterant. Okay. There have been multiple cases of diethylene glycol adulteration in history, including a very famous one in 1986 in Mumbai at the JJ hospital, where around 13 people died after getting diethylene glycol contaminated glycerin. In this case, this was diethylene glycol contaminated cough syrup. There was one of the solvents, which is propylene glycol, was most likely adulterated with diethylene glycol. So there are certain products which are vulnerable to diethylene glycol contamination. And these products are basically these sweet, viscous solvent products which look very similar to diethylene glycol. So visual inspection cannot help you tell them apart. And you need slightly more sophisticated testing. So for this reason, unscrupulous manufacturers tend to dilute glycerin with diethylene glycol and propylene glycol with diethylene glycol, or even other excipients like mannitol, etc. So this vulnerability is well known, which is why our laws, which is the Indian Pharmacopoeia, requires all propylene glycol, which was a solvent in the cough syrup, to be tested for diethylene glycol. Clearly, this hadn't happened in the case of Digital Vision, the Himachal company. So how did it happen? I mean, the only explanation, Digital Vision is a company which is licensed. It has been manufacturing for over 10 years. Now, this is not a fly-by-night operator, okay? This is a kind of thing that can happen with a company which has no license, which is manufacturing spurious drugs and pushing it into the market. But Digital Vision, the fact that it's licensed means that the Himachal drug inspector ought to have been inspecting them every single year. And, they basically undergo a lot more scrutiny, right? Which is why it's insane that such a well-known adulterant got into the product and just, they didn't do anything about it. So the significance of this incident is that it could not have happened if the Himachal Pradesh drug regulator had not neglected this company over several years. Right? I find it very hard to believe that a licensed manufacturing company would not be able to identify such an important source of adulteration. And so when this whole thing began, I spoke to the Himachal drug regulator on several times to understand how they dealt with previous instances of substandard drugs in the case of Digital Vision. And I learned that their general attitude was very casual and very lax, right? Because every time their drugs would, let's say, fail an identity test or a dissolution test or an impurity test, what they're required to do is they should ask the company to look into it, do a root cause analysis, and identify a GMP failure that led to it. This almost never happened, right? In the past 10 years or so. They would say, why is this dissolution failure happening? The company would say, so one of the excuses many of these companies make is that, our drug was of good quality, but during distribution, the distributor or the retail shopkeeper did not store it in proper circumstances, and that led to the drug getting degraded, right? That's really not an acceptable excuse for multiple reasons. But the Himachal drug regulator would keep accepting this excuse, and they would let them off with merely a rap on the knuckles. So they would basically cancel the license for that particular substandard drug for something like 15 days, 20 days, 1 month, which makes no difference to a company which is making literally thousands of drugs. Like, I don't know, maybe 600, 700. More so because the regulator has no means of enforcing that ban either. Okay. So if the company is continuing to test the drug, it's not like they can, randomly go and check stores for whether it is still available. They don't have the manpower to do that either. So the company just keep getting away for years and years with making these substandard drugs. And so if you really go back and look at how things happened in the past decade, you shouldn't be so surprised at what happened here, right? I would think it's a natural progression. And I think the most worrying part is that this doesn't happen with Digital Vision alone. It 100% happens with many other companies. Because when I was following up on this story and when I was speaking to I spoke to several experts on drug quality, etc., and I would say, look, the Himachal drug regulator would just keep ignoring these cases of substandard drugs year after year. And they would say, why are you focusing on Digital Vision? This happens with everybody. So the thing is that just because the Digital Vision incident blew up because, number one, children died and a hospital was able to make the link to a drug. Now, how many times does it happen that people die, but you're not able to make the link to the drug? It's really hard work to make that link. So just because you don't make the link, I'm 100% sure there are many such instances flying under the radar. Secondly, these poor quality drugs don't always kill. Okay. So let's say you take a poor quality BP drug. Your BP might not be in control in one batch. Your BP will not be in control for a month or so until you go to the next batch. How would you even know it's because of the drug and not because of something else? In order to identify this kind of issue, you need a very strong pharmacovigilance system where your doctor who's treating you realizes that your BP is sort of going out of control for reasons they cannot understand, and therefore they report to the pharmacovigilance system, and the system looks into the particular batch. It's a very involved process. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. This process actually happens in some countries, but it doesn't happen in India. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that ignoring substandard drugs is not uncommon, but the fact that incidents like Digital Vision are happening is a sign that we ignore them, a lot more than we think. So,
it's so scary to just listen to this, right? Because even reasonably well-educated, probably young people of this country, they often at least once in their lives have gone to a pharmacy and said, hey, listen, I have this problem. I don't have the time to go to a doctor. Can you give me something, right? And we know how this is probably 10x or even 100x in tier 3 towns or in remote villages, etc., where access to great medical consulting is just so beyond the reach for various reasons of much of this population, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just as a consumer, who's sort of listening to this, what do we control today? Like what can we control, and how safe are we when we enter a pharmacy?
So what do we control today? This is such a tough question to answer. So, this is the reason why drugs are called credence goods, right? Because the person buying the drug has no idea about the quality of it. And they have no way to tell the quality of it, right? Including the people who got the bad batch of Remdesivir. Do they know today that was endotoxin contaminated? No. They just fell sick and they were discharged, and which is why medicine quality is such a tricky issue, right? Unless your drug regulator is sort of on the ball and doing their side of the job, consumers really cannot do much except maybe stick to certain brands, because I know for a fact that the Indian medical community, doctors, have developed their own way of dealing with issued substandard drugs. And many of us don't really know this. But so, for instance, in the case of this Coldbest case, when I was speaking to the doctors in Chandigarh who basically identified the diethylene glycol, I would ask them, doesn't it bother you? There's this really extraordinary social pediatrician called Bhavneet Bharti who led the investigation into the diethylene glycol case in PGI-MER. And I was asking her, doesn't this entire issue bother you that there are drugs and you don't know about their quality? And one of the things she said is that, I know this major issue, but I never knew until now that substandard drugs could kill. Right. So then I said, yeah, but still the drugs may not work, which is also a problem. And she was like, yeah, this happens all the time. And she narrated an incident where she used to look after an orphanage in Chandigarh where the children were being treated for scabies, this worm infestation, this parasitic infection, the skin infection. Yeah. And she had prescribed to them permethrin, which is cream, and it was simply not working. No matter what she did, the children were not getting cured. So then she spoke to a dermatologist in the hospital and he said, which brand are you using? And she said, this brand. And she said, no, don't use this brand. Always use this particular brand. And so she used that brand and the children immediately got better. And this happens not just there. I have come across more than one incident. So doctors are aware of the need for prescribing certain brands which they trust more, which is why when the Indian government recently introduced a circular asking doctors to prescribe only generic drugs, there was a lot of resistance to the idea because they wanted to stick to brands that had developed a reputation over a period of time. That doesn't mean that brands are not vulnerable to issues. They are. It's just that I think perhaps they have more of an incentive to maintain their quality standards because if something happens, it's sort of associated. But as patients, I think really, the need of the hour is to have more awareness about drug quality issues. It's just so low. A lot of the narrative in India about drugs has been about access to medicine. How do we drive down the costs so that they're available far and wide, right? Including some of these really high-end biological sophisticated drugs. But too little of the conversation is about quality, right? How often do we talk about, and also the interplay between cost and quality? Like, does it really make sense to just keep driving down costs at a crazy rate if it is going to compromise quality? And I suspect that is happening in some of these government programs like Jan Aushadhi, which are procuring drugs at ridiculously low rates from manufacturers. Now, if you're putting that kind of cost pressure on manufacturers, and if you have no system in place to control quality anyway, all quality parameters are going to go out of the window. So I think as consumers, the first thing we can do is become more aware.
Right. As you talk, it is clear that there's no incentive even for a well-meaning pharma company to put in the rigor, right? Besides, of course, the moral incentives of this. Now, I'm just thinking, something like a US healthcare system comes under so much ridicule and criticism, and rightfully so for many things. But, those are markets internationally where you can assume a certain level of rigor when it comes to saving people's lives, isn't it? But for a country like India, one that is especially aspiring to become the pharmacy of the world, quote unquote, the fact that our drug regulation is in shambles, it doesn't really augur well for that narrative, no?
Not at all, because I think that's a bit of a twisted narrative, which just ignores the quality side. Like, it's not just about increasing supply, infinitely, right? That's not the only thing that matters. It's also about high quality drugs. And, another interesting point I wanted to make is that you're talking about lack of incentive for manufacturers. So there was a major survey in India in 2015 by the National Institute of Biologicals, again, to look at the rate of substandard drugs. And it found a major difference in our government drug supply and the open market drug supply. And it found that organizations like CGHS and ESIC and government pharmacies, which procure drugs from companies, have a 10% substandard rate compared to a 3% substandard rate in the open market. Okay. Why? Because, and there's been quite a bit of research into this, which is government procurers, what they do and their quality systems. And that is because these government procurers are going by these, lowest quote, this tender system where they're going to the manufacturer which can supply the drug at the lowest cost possible. And there is a lot of research into this area which shows that many of these brand companies actually avoid government tenders altogether. They don't even participate because they feel like it's not viable to them, and there's no clarity in terms of, when they will get paid, blah, blah, blah. And to me, really, that is what we need to think about more as consumers as urban consumers from the, mid-high income sector. Because I would think the bigger problem in India is government drug supply. That's a problem we need to fix first. If your brand name manufacturers are actually avoiding the government system and, this supplies to so many people in the country, isn't that really worrying? Isn't the government supposed to be sort of this? Intuitively, you would expect that drugs in the government supply are of higher quality. But the reason I think we should focus on it first is we should focus on the low-hanging fruit first. You and I are probably protected to a certain extent because we go to doctors who may be able to prescribe brand name drugs, who are able to switch, who have access to. There are some hospitals which even have their own quality control, internal quality control. Like I believe CMC Vellore does some amount of internal checking for the drugs that come to their hospital. So you and I are relatively more protected, I would say, compared to a large part of the country. So I really think we need to look into this first. And I also think manufacturers, just the way Indian manufacturers can get away with supplying a different drug to other countries and to India, even the state level differences matter. So manufacturers know which states have weaker drug controllers. So they can actually dump substandard products into states like UP, which don't have sterility and injectable testing. How difficult it is for them to figure out that the state lacks random testing, lacks the capacity to randomly test injectable drugs. So I think we need to fix the weakest link first. That good drugs do exist in this country, and they're probably going to the wealthiest amongst us. And that's really an unfortunate situation, because when we judge the quality of drugs in this country, we should judge it according to the quality which goes to the poorest people, right? The largest number of people, which is the drugs that go to the government sector and to small impoverished hamlets like Ramnagar in Jammu, where children died from drinking adulterated cough syrup.
Yeah. Just to, in closure, what I find most bizarre in this whole thing is that every state has its own interpretation of this. It almost seems like, right, from what you're saying. It's like the same drug, could be like, going back to the first example, we spoke about the Remdesivir example. Bihar is able to ban it, while there is no real way in which it is actually sharing that intelligence with the rest of the states, or there's no national alarm that goes off when Bihar bans it, right? It has come down to a state level interpretation, and especially in a country like India, where everything from taxes is now at a central level. This is a very unsustainable model, right? Do you see that changing anytime soon?
That's actually one of the top recommendations made by a lot of people, that we cannot have 30 different drug regulators for this country, because, and what you mentioned is actually the least of it. The Bihar Remdesivir example, that was a testing difference, right? It was availability of infrastructure difference. But different states are also interpreting standards differently. Like, even though the IP is the only, the Indian Pharmacopoeia is the standard for the entire country, but state drug regulators have, so whenever a state drug regulator comes across a substandard drug, the law allows them to prosecute, right? Regardless of, how substandard it is. But different states have come up with different interpretations of what is unacceptable and what is not. And it's actually kind of ridiculous, because Gujarat will not prosecute any company for, so I was talking about the quantity test. So in a oral dosage form, if paracetamol is less than 95%, then it's substandard. Now, Gujarat will not prosecute a maker of paracetamol until the paracetamol is 0%, okay, missing altogether. Maharashtra will not prosecute a manufacturer unless the paracetamol is 50%. Karnataka has a different number. Kerala has a different number. Some other state has 70%. So essentially, all these state regulators have just arbitrarily decided what percentage of active ingredient is bad enough to prosecute and what is not. To me, that's the most insane example. I talk about this in one of my stories. I would encourage listeners to listen to it. So this is absolute madness, because why? I mean, are we really saying that unless paracetamol is 0% in a drug in Gujarat, people will not be affected, and somehow people in Kerala are less resilient to the quantity of paracetamol in the drug? I mean, it's a very ridiculous situation. So many people have called for all the state regulators to be combined into one single regulator, with the state regulator having relatively lesser discretion in terms of how they implement the law. That's in fact one of the key reforms we can make, but I'm not entirely sure that is on the agenda of the people who are rewriting the DNC Act right now.
That's just ridiculously, absurdly weird, and it just it's just dark humor, isn't it? Priyanka, we're at the 90-minute mark, and you mentioned that the best that one can do at this point is be very aware of what is going on, because certainly this is not going to make national headlines anytime soon, which is why, and I know I speak for everyone who's listening to this episode, extremely grateful for the kind of work you're doing. And the links to the articles we discussed, I will share in the show notes. But beyond that, are there any other sources of information that you would like to recommend to someone who's listening to the show for them to be more aware of what's going on?
So every state is supposed to publish the substandard drugs found, in its jurisdiction, within the month or so. So if you go to your state regulator's website, you may find that list. Ideally, all these substandard drugs are supposed to be recalled from the market, which is another thing that doesn't happen across the board. Most states, I think, don't do any recall at all. Some states are better than the others. But I would think, check your drug regulator's website once in a while to look at these substandard drugs. But in terms of so you're asking for like reading recommendations in terms of understanding drug quality issue?
Yeah, I was. But this seems to be the most important reading recommendation of all.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I think Bottle of Lies is an excellent book. It's a really good start by Catherine Eban. Yeah. So there's another book by K.L. Sharma, which is Healing the Pharmacy of the World. He's basically a health secretary to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare a while back. And he's written a book on which very concisely summarizes some of the very, very long-standing problems with Indian drug quality. So the unfortunate part is these problems have been known forever, right? What I'm talking to you today is probably what somebody would have been talking about 10 years ago. But if you, and yet nobody's done anything about it. But if you want to get a sort of a bird's eye view, I would recommend that book, Healing the Pharmacy of the World. And that's it for now.
Wonderful. Great. Yeah. Priyanka, thank you so much. It was extraordinarily chilling and eye-opening. And thanks again for the extraordinary work that you do in reporting this and helping us make sense of it all. And good luck for whatever's coming next on your plate.
Thank you so much. This was fun for me. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was our show this week. I hope you liked it. And if you did, and if you're a fan of the show, hey, I have something to ask of you. If you are listening to the show on Spotify or Apple right now, please do rate us on the respective app. It helps a lot in others discovering the show. And if you have any feedback on the show, I would love to hear from you. You can send it to filterkoffeepodcast@gmail.com. Happy listening and see you next week with another episode.
जिस तरीके से हमारे माँ बाप ने अपने करियर की सीढ़ियाँ चढ़ी थी, वैसे आज के जमाने में तो पॉसिबल है ही नहीं गुरु, क्योंकि हमारा जमाना इतना कॉम्प्लिकेटेड है। आज क्या नहीं है, कंपटीशन है, सोशल मीडिया है, इतना इंफॉर्मेशन ओवरलोड है कि करियर का टेंशन ज्यादा होता है, उस पर काम कम। टेंशन लेने से कोई फायदा तो है नहीं। क्या करते हैं, ठंडे दिमाग से सुनते हैं प्रोबेशन से प्रमोशन तक पॉडकास्ट को हर सोमवार, जहाँ पे सिर्फ प्रैक्टिकल बातें होती हैं आपके करियर की। और कौन करता है वो? मैं आपका होस्ट अभिनव त्रिवेदी। ये पॉडकास्ट आप सुन सकते हैं IVM पॉडकास्ट की वेबसाइट, ऐप या फिर किसी भी अन्य पॉडकास्ट स्ट्रीमिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर।
Love fighting?
We've got you covered.
Check out our show, The Fighting Goat, where we, the voices of the internet, Arjun Chipalkatti and Somesh Kamra, bring to you crazy weekly action on your favorite combat show, The Fighting Goat.
Be it commentary, breakdown, predictions, analysis of styles and techniques.
And of course, your round of favorite fighters.
You can listen to us every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, and all major podcast streaming platforms.